On the 27th of July 1656, a 23-year-old man walked into a synagogue in Amsterdam and was handed the most severe excommunication ever recorded in the history of that Jewish community. The document was read aloud, in Hebrew, with candles extinguished one by one as the words were spoken. The congregation was instructed to have no contact with him, to conduct no business with him, to read nothing he wrote, to come no closer to him than 4 cubits, to share no roof with him. No reason was given, not in the document, not in any surviving record. The community that expelled him left no explanation, just the verdict, just the darkness of the extinguished candles, just the door closing behind a young man who would never return to the community that had formed him, whose God he had studied with more devotion than almost anyone around him, whose language he read and wrote and thought in. He walked out into Amsterdam, and then, in the silence that followed, he began to think. What he produced from that thinking over the next 20 years, in small rooms, grinding lenses for a living, writing in Latin, sharing manuscripts cautiously with a small circle of trusted friends, dying at 44 from the lung disease that the glass dust had accelerated, is one of the most extraordinary intellectual achievements in human history. Not extraordinary because it is difficult, though it is difficult. Extraordinarily difficult in places, written in the form of geometric proofs, definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, with the deliberate coldness of mathematics, as if the author believed that emotional language would allow the reader to escape what the argument was actually saying. He did not want you to escape. His name was Baruch Spinoza. Later, Benedict de Spinoza, in the Latinized form he used for correspondence with the European intellectual world. A man of such absolute intellectual honesty that he became, in his own lifetime, the most dangerous philosopher in Europe. A man whose books were banned in multiple countries, whose name was used as the synonym for atheism for a century after his death, whose philosophy was so threatening to every established framework, religious, political, moral, that the full weight of what he had done took more than 200 years to be absorbed. And even now it has not been fully absorbed, because what Spinoza did, quietly, carefully, with geometric precision in a series of small rooms, was not merely propose a new philosophical system. He rewrote the architecture of reality itself. He asked what God actually is, and followed the answer wherever it led, and arrived at a place so far from conventional theism and so far from conventional atheism that neither camp has ever been entirely comfortable claiming him. He arrived at a place where God and nature are the same thing, where everything that exists is an expression of one single infinite substance, where the human being is not a soul housed in a body, not a free agent standing outside the causal order and choosing its destiny, not the image of a personal God who hears prayers and intervenes in history, but a mode, a temporary, finite, particular expression of the one infinite thing. A wave in the ocean, real in its waving but made of ocean, constituted by ocean, inseparable from ocean. Now think about this for a moment. This does not sound immediately threatening. It sounds almost beautiful. The unity of everything, the single infinite substance of the wave in the ocean. In certain moods, in certain lights, it sounds like mysticism of a comforting kind. The kind you might find on a retreat or in a passage of particularly lyrical nature writing, or in the reported experiences of people who have glimpsed, in some extreme moment of beauty or extremity, the sense that the separation between themselves and everything else is less absolute than they normally believe. But Spinoza's vision is not mysticism. It is not a feeling, it is an argument. And the argument has consequences that are far less comfortable than the feeling. If God and nature are the same thing, if the infinite substance that Spinoza calls God or nature, Deus sive natura, is not a person, not a mind, not a being who created the world from outside it and can intervene in it and respond to prayer and harbour intentions and issue commandments, then everything that has been built on the assumption of that personal God comes into question. Morality, law, the meaning of death, the purpose of suffering, the significance of the individual life, the possibility of free will, the ground of political authority, everything. Spinoza does not flinch from any of these consequences. He follows every one of them to its conclusion. With the remorseless patience of man who's already paid the price of honesty, the price was the excommunication, the isolation, the lifelong marginality, and has decided that having paid it, he will spend whatever time he has left being as honest as it is possible to be. The result is a philosophy that is, in the truest sense, total, does not leave anything out. It addresses the nature of God, the structure of reality, the mechanics of the human mind, the anatomy of the emotions, the basis of ethics, the theory of political freedom, the possibility of human liberation. And it addresses all of these things as parts of a single argument, a single vision, a single attempt to see the whole of reality clearly. And what it sees, when you follow it carefully, when you do not look away from the places where it demands that you look, is one of the most disturbing and most liberating things that human thought has ever produced. Disturbing because it removes certain comforts that most people depend on. Liberating because what it offers in their place, not as a consolation but as a genuine alternative, is something that Spinoza believed was more real, more durable, and more genuinely available than the comforts it replaces. He called it beatitude, not happiness, not pleasure, not even peace in the ordinary sense. Something he describes as the intellectual love of God, a love of the whole, a love of the necessity, a love of existence precisely as it is, produced not by the warming of the heart but by the clearing of the mind. He thought this was possible for human beings. He thought it was the only thing worth pursuing, and he thought the path to it ran directly through the most difficult thing available to a human consciousness. Seeing clearly, without exception, without protective illusion, without the comforting story, just seeing. We are going to follow that seeing from the beginning through every step of the argument, not because it is comfortable, because it is one of the most honest things ever written. Before Spinoza can tell you what God is, he has to tell you what existence is. Before he can tell you what the human being is, he has to tell you what reality is made of. And before he can tell you any of that, he has to get through the definitions, the axioms, the geometric apparatus that he deliberately chose as his vehicle, not to be obscure, but to be inescapable. Because Spinoza knew that the conclusions he was building toward were so disturbing that if he allowed the reader any room to maneuver, any ambiguity of language, any emotional appeal, any rhetorical exit, the reader would take it. He chose the form of geometric proof specifically to close the exits. If you accept the definitions and the axioms, you must accept the conclusions. There is no way out except to reject the premises. Most people, reading him, eventually try to reject the premises, but the premises are very hard to reject. He begins with the concept of substance. A substance, he says, is something that exists in itself and is conceived through itself. It requires nothing outside itself either to exist or to be understood. It is entirely self-sufficient, both ontologically and conceptually. Now ask, how many such things can there be? Spinoza's answer is one, exactly one, and the proof is compact and devastating. If there were two substances, they would have to be distinguished somehow. They would have to differ in some attribute or property. But if they differ in their attributes, then each is defined partly by what it is not. Each requires reference to the other to be fully understood. And something that requires reference to another thing to be understood is not, by definition, a substance in the strict sense. It is dependent. It is not fully self-sufficient. Therefore, if substance exists at all, if there is anything that is genuinely self-sufficient, that exists in itself, and is conceived through itself, there can only be one of it. And that one substance must be infinite, must have infinite attributes. Because if it were limited in any way, if there was some attribute or property it lacked, then the limit would imply something outside it that it was not. And something outside it would mean it was not truly self-sufficient, not truly the only substance. 1. Infinite, self-sufficient, containing everything that is or could be. Spinoza calls this God. He also calls it nature, and he means exactly the same thing by both words. But here's the strange part. This God is not personal, does not have intentions, does not hear prayers, did not create the world in the sense of choosing to create it from a position of prior non-creation. The world did not come into existence by an act of divine will at a particular moment in time. The world is an expression, a necessary, eternal, non-optional expression of the one infinite substance. It had to exist. It could not have been otherwise. Not because God forced it into existence, but because existence is what God is. The infinite substance necessarily expresses itself in everything that exists, has existed, and will exist. The universe was not made, it is, and it is because God is, and God is because existence is, and existence is necessarily infinitely completely, without beginning, without end, without purpose in the ordinary sense of purpose, without the possibility of being other than it is. Now the consequences start to land. The first consequence is the end of the God of the Bible as a coherent concept, not a polite revision of the concept. An end. Because the God of the Bible is a being who acts, who chooses, who creates and destroys and commands and forgives and becomes angry and relents, who is in a relationship with humanity, a relationship that has a history that has been shaped by specific events, that involves responses to specific prayers and specific transgressions. Spinoza's God does nothing of this, cannot, because doing, acting, choosing, responding requires that things could have been otherwise, requires that the God who acts could have acted differently. But in Spinoza's system, nothing could have been otherwise. Everything that exists exists with the same necessity with which 2 + 2 = 4. There was no moment of divine choice. There is no ongoing divine intervention. There is only the eternal, necessary, perfectly determined unfolding of the infinite substance through its infinite attributes and their infinite modes. God does not choose to create you. You are a mode of God, a particular finite temporary expression of the one infinite thing. Not created, not caused in the way a craftsman causes a table, expressed as necessarily and as non-optionally as a mathematical truth is expressed by the axioms that contain it. Think about what this does to prayer. Prayer, in most religious traditions, is addressed to a personal being who hears it and may or may not respond, who has intentions and the freedom to act on them, who can be moved by the sincerity of the petition, by the quality of the relationship, by compassion or justice or love, to intervene in the causal order on behalf of the person praying. Spinoza's God cannot be moved, has no intentions to act on, is not personal in any sense that makes prayer a coherent activity. The infinite substance does not hear, does not choose, does not intervene. It simply is, in everything, through everything, as everything. Prayer is addressed to something that is already necessarily, completely present in everything, including the person praying. It is like asking the ocean to pay attention to a particular wave. Now think about what this does to the problem of evil. One of the oldest and most painful questions in theology. If God is all-powerful and all-good and all-knowing, why is there suffering? Why are children born with terrible diseases? Why do innocent people suffer catastrophically while the cruel flourish? The answers theology has produced, free will, divine testing, the mystery of God's ways, are all ways of reconciling an all-powerful, benevolent, personal God with the manifest presence of what looks, from the human perspective, like radical injustice. Spinoza dissolves the problem by dissolving its premise. There is no all-powerful, benevolent, personal God. There is only the one infinite substance expressing itself necessarily in everything. Good and evil are not features of the universe. They are human evaluations, judgments we make about things in relation to our own interests and well-being. The universe does not contain good and evil. It contains what is. The category of good and evil is a human imposition on a reality that is beyond those categories. This sounds like cold comfort. It is cold. It is not offered as comfort. It is offered as what is true. And Spinoza believed this is the center of everything, the claim that everything else builds toward, that seeing what is true, however cold, is the beginning of the only genuine liberation available to a human being. Not liberation from suffering necessarily. Liberation through understanding. The specific, remarkable, hard-won freedom of the person who sees the necessity of everything and in seeing it ceases to be tormented by the wish that it were otherwise. We are nowhere near that liberation yet. We have only just cleared the ground. The one infinite substance exists. It is God. It is nature. It is everything. But everything appears in different ways. The rock and the thought about the rock seem like different kinds of things. The body and the mind seem like different kinds of things. Matter and consciousness seem like different kinds of things. So different, in fact, that one of the most persistent and most baffling problems in the history of philosophy is how they relate. How the physical, or the brain, the neurons, the electrochemical processes, gives rise to the mental. How a thought, which seems to have no weight or location or measurable extension in space, can be produced by a lump of matter. Descartes, one generation before Spinoza, had proposed the most famous attempted solution. Mind and matter are two entirely distinct substances, completely different in their nature. Mind is non-extended, non-spatial, purely thinking. Matter is extended, spatial, purely mechanical. They are as different as anything can be. And then, having made them completely different, Descartes had to explain how they interact. how the mental intention to raise an arm produces the physical rising of an arm. His answer, that they interact in the pineal gland, satisfied almost no one. The problem was not the location. The problem was the principle. How can something purely non-extended produce effects in something purely extended? How can the two substances, having been made completely different, be put back together? They cannot, not coherently. The Cartesian split is one of the most productive mistakes in the history of philosophy. Productive because it defined the problem clearly enough for every subsequent thinker to engage with. Mistaken because the problem it defined is one it cannot solve. Spinoza cuts the knot. There are not two substances. There is one. Mind and matter are not different substances. They are different attributes of the one infinite substance. Ways of understanding the same thing from different angles, the same reality, apprehended through different conceptual frameworks. He says, "The order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things." This sentence is one of the most important in all of philosophy, and it is worth sitting with. What it means is this. The mental and the physical are not two separate series of events that somehow influence each other. They are one series of events, described in two different languages. The thought and the brain state that accompanies the thought are not two things in a causal relationship. They are one thing, one mode of the one infinite substance, apprehended under two different attributes. Under the attribute of thought, it appears as a mental event. Under the attribute of extension, it appears as a physical event. Two descriptions, one reality. Now think about this for a moment. This has an immediate and profound consequence for how you understand yourself. You're not a soul in a body. You're not a ghost in a machine in Descartes' haunted formulation. You're not a mind that happens to be attached to a physical organism and will, at death, separate from it and continue in some purely mental form. You're a mode of the one infinite substance, a finite, particular temporary expression of God or nature. Considered under the attribute of thought, you are a mind. Considered under the attribute of extension, you are a body. These are not two things you are. They are one thing, one mode, described from two perspectives. The mind does not move the body does not cause the mind. They are the same thing. They unfold in perfect parallel because they are one event, described in two languages that will never fully translate into each other, but that are always, at every moment, saying the same thing about the same reality. This is called the doctrine of psychophysical parallelism, and it sounds, when stated abstractly, like a technical solution to a technical problem. But its implications for self-understanding are enormous, because if the mind and body are one thing, if every mental event has its physical correlate, and every physical event has its mental correlate, not because one causes the other, but because they are the same event in different descriptions, then the sharp distinction between thinking and feeling, between reason and emotion, between the mental life and the physical life, is not a distinction between different substances. It is a distinction between different modes of the one. You cannot, in Spinoza's system, separate yourself from your body and call the separated thing your true self. The body is not the prison of the soul. The body is the other face of the same reality that the mind is. To understand yourself is to understand both simultaneously, not as related things, but as aspects of a single thing. This is already disturbing to ordinary self-understanding, but what follows from it is more disturbing still. If you're a mode of the one infinite substance, a particular finite expression of the same necessity that governs everything, then the freedom you believe yourself to have is not what you think it is. The Cartesian self, the mind as separate substance, as the locus of genuine free choice, is gone. You're not standing outside the causal order choosing. You're inside it. You are it. Your thoughts, your decisions, your choices, your sense of deliberating and selecting and authoring your own actions, all of this is itself part of the infinite causal chain. All of it is the necessary unfolding of the one substance through one of its finite modes. You're not free in the sense you thought you were. Spinoza makes this claim with full clarity and without apology. The will is not free. There is no uncaused choice, no first cause of action that originates in a self that stands outside the chain of causes. Every decision you make is the necessary result of what you are, your nature, your constitution, your desires and beliefs, and the specific confluence of causes that produce them, combined with the external circumstances that present themselves to you. Given all of that, the decision was determined. Could not have been otherwise. You're not an author, you're an expression. But here's the strange part. This is not the end of freedom for Spinoza. It is the beginning of it. Because there is a kind of freedom available that does not require the uncaused will. A kind of freedom that is not the freedom from the causal order, but a freedom within it. A freedom that is not about choosing otherwise, but about understanding what you are choosing and why. He calls it self-determination, the state in which you are caused by your own nature rather than by external forces you do not understand. Not freedom from causation. Freedom through understanding your causation. The difference between the free person and the unfree person in Spinoza's system is not that one is inside the causal order and one is outside it. They are both inside it. The difference is that one understands the order and the other is driven by it without knowing they are driven. That distinction between understanding and being driven is the hinge of everything that follows. The word bondage is deliberate, not weakness, not imperfection, not the unfortunate tendency toward moral failure that better effort might correct. Bondage, the condition of the person who is in chains they do not know they are wearing, who is driven by forces they experience as their own choosing, who believes they are free because they do not know what is driving them. Spinoza is not contemptuous of this condition. He is precise about it. He spent years in it before the philosophy found its full shape, and he describes it with the specific accuracy of someone who knows it from the inside. The fundamental mechanism of human bondage is simple to state, and almost impossible to escape without the specific kind of understanding he is pointing toward. Human beings are driven primarily by imagination, not reason. Not imagination in the creative sense, not the faculty that produces art and invention. Imagination in Spinoza's technical sense, the mode of knowledge that operates from sensory experience and memory and association. The mode that takes particular, finite, fragmented pieces of the world and produces from them the beliefs and desires and fears that govern ordinary life. And the problem with imagination as a guide is not that it's unreliable in the ordinary empirical sense, not that it makes factual errors, though it does. The deeper problem is that it shows things in their particularity rather than their necessity. Imagination shows you this specific thing in this specific relationship to yourself at this specific moment. It shows you the partial picture, the fragment and the slice. And from the partial picture, it generates emotions, desire, fear, hope, grief, that are responses to the partial picture rather than to the whole. When you desire something, you desire this particular thing because your imagination presents it as the source of your enhancement, your joy, your increase in power. You do not see it sub specie eternitatis, under the aspect of eternity, in its full, necessary, determined reality as a mode of the one infinite substance. You see it as the source of what you want, and you are moved by that seeing with the full force of the conatus. And the thing you desire when you get it does not do what you imagined it would do, because what you imagined was a fragment, and the fragment was only partially true. The fragment did not contain the whole picture, the full consequences, the actual nature of the thing, its place in the larger necessity that you have not yet seen. This is the mechanism of hope and fear, of love and hatred, of all the passive emotions that drive human behavior with such force and such frequency toward outcomes that do not produce what was sought. Hope is always accompanied by fear, Spinoza notes, because hope is oriented towards something uncertain, a future good that might not materialize, and the same uncertainty that makes the outcome possible also makes it impossible to fully rest in the hope without the fear of its not occurring. They are, he says, the same emotion. Hope is the fluctuating face of joy in the presence of uncertainty. Fear is the fluctuating face of sadness in the same uncertainty, and human beings live in this fluctuation constantly, between hope and fear, between the imagination of good outcomes and the imagination of bad ones, between the desire for what is not yet and the dread of what might come, driven by images of the future that are inevitably partial, necessarily uncertain, constitutively unable to provide the stable foundation that the striving self is always seeking. But here's the strange part. Spinoza identifies something that most moral philosophies miss entirely. He says, human beings do not pursue things because they judge them good. They judge things good because they pursue them. Read that again. The ordinary assumption is that we first recognize something as good and then desire it. That goodness is the reason for desire. That if we could only reason correctly about what is truly good, our desires would align with our genuine well-being. Spinoza inverts this. The desire comes first. The judgment of goodness is the rationalization of the desire. What the conatus strives toward, what the whole person, body-mind simultaneously is oriented toward, that thing gets labelled good. What the conatus moves away from gets labelled bad. Goodness and badness are not objective features of things that the mind perceives and responds to. They are projections of the organism striving onto the things it encounters. This is not moral nihilism. Spinoza is not saying there is no difference between genuine well-being and its opposite. He is saying that the ordinary human mechanism for pursuing well-being, driven by imagination, by the labelling of desired things as good, is not reliable, because the imagination shows fragments. And fragments, desired as if they were wholes, produce the specific suffering of the person who gets what they wanted and finds it was not what they needed. The tyranny of particular attachments, the violence of thwarted desire, the way that love, the most powerful of the passive emotions, can become, when the loved object is lost, or when it fails to behave as imagined, a source of suffering proportionate to its former intensity. Spinoza writes, "Love which perishes with the object loved is not true love." This sentence is not a romantic observation, it is a diagnosis. The love that depends on this particular finite mode, this specific person, this specific object, this specific source of enhancement, is a love whose happiness is hostage to the continued existence and behaviour of the thing loved, which is hostage, therefore, to the infinite causal chain that determines everything, which is hostage to necessity, which is finally not free, and the unfreedom is not just intellectual, it is emotional. It is the specific suffering of the person who has placed their joy in something finite, however real, however genuinely valuable, and finds inevitably that the finite thing cannot sustain the infinite weight of the happiness that has been placed on it. This is the bondage, beautifully, brutally described. And now the question, is there a way out? Not a way out of the causal order, that is not available, and Spinoza is not offering it. Not a way out of the world's indifference to human desire, that is not available either, and the philosophy does not pretend otherwise. A way out of the specific suffering that is produced not by the world's necessity, but by the human being's failure to understand it. The suffering that is not caused by the necessity, but by the resistance to it, by the imagination of how things should be, pressing against the reality of how things are, by the wish for the finite to be infinite, by the love of fragments mistaken for the whole. The way out is the whole. The way out is seeing. And the seeing, the specific, transformative, emotionally powerful seeing that Spinoza calls the third kind of knowledge, is what everything has been building toward. Spinoza divides human knowledge into three kinds, not as an arbitrary taxonomy, as a description of genuinely different modes of engagement with reality, different ways of knowing that produce different emotional states, different relationships to the world, and different capacities for what he calls freedom. The first kind is the lowest. He calls it knowledge from random experience and from signs. It is the knowledge of ordinary life, the knowledge that accumulates from sensory experience, from what other people tell us, from the associations and habits and memories that constitute our practical understanding of how things work. This is the knowledge through which most people navigate most of their existence. It is not worthless. It is functional. Without it, ordinary life would not be possible. But it is the knowledge of surfaces, of particulars, of things as they present themselves to the senses and the imagination in their specific, fragmented, partial form. It does not grasp necessity. It does not see why things must be as they are. It sees what is the case, or what appears to be the case, without understanding the structure that makes it necessarily so. And from this kind of knowledge arise the passive emotions, the hopes and fears and loves and hatreds that are responses to the partial picture, that are oriented toward fragments mistaken for wholes. The second kind of knowledge is reason, the capacity to understand things through their common properties and necessary relations. The kind of knowledge that science produces, the grasp of laws, of structures, of the necessary connections between things that hold regardless of particular cases. This is a genuine advance. The person who understands at the level of reason that everything is necessarily determined, that the causal order is complete and allows no exceptions, is already liberated from certain forms of suffering. They cannot maintain with intellectual honesty the belief that things could have been otherwise, the grief that includes the wish for a different past, if only this had not happened, if only I had chosen differently, loses some of its force in the face of understood necessity. But the second kind of knowledge is still, in an important sense, abstract. It grasps necessity in general without grasping the specific concrete necessity of this particular thing. It understands the laws without seeing through the laws to the one substance that the laws describe. The third kind of knowledge is something else entirely. Spinoza calls it intuitive science, scientia intuitiva, and the name is important. It suggests something that is neither the haziness of intuition in the ordinary sense, nor the cold distance of science in the ordinary sense. Something that combines the immediacy and certainty of direct perception with the comprehensiveness and necessity of the deepest rational understanding. It is the direct grasp of particular things under the aspect of eternity, subspecie eternitatis, not the grasp of the general law, the grasp of this specific thing, this person, this moment, this particular mode of the infinite substance, in its necessary, eternal, completely determined reality as an expression of God or nature. The direct seeing of the divine in the particular, not metaphorically, not as a spiritual practice, as a mode of knowledge. Now think about this for a moment. What changes when you see something subspecie eternitatis? Not what it is. What you see is exactly what it is. The change is in the relationship between the seer and the seen. The partial, fragmentary, emotionally driven relationship of the first kind of knowledge, in which this particular thing is seen only in its relationship to your desire and your fear, as a source of potential joy or potential sadness, is replaced by the comprehensive, clear, necessary grasp of the thing as it actually is, as a mode of the one infinite substance, as something that exists with the same necessity with which every other thing exists, as something whose nature and whose place in the whole is fully determined and fully real. And this seeing changes the emotion, not by suppressing the emotion, by transforming it. The love that was attached to this particular finite thing, the love that was a hostage to the thing's continued existence and proper behavior, becomes, in the light of the third kind of knowledge, something different, something that Spinoza calls the intellectual love of God, not the love of this specific finite mode dependent on its continuation, the love of what the finite mode is an expression of, the love of the whole, the love of the necessary, the love of existence precisely as it is, in all its particularity, all its determination, all its beautiful, indifferent, perfectly ordered necessity. This love cannot be disappointed, because it is not addressed to something that might change or fail or disappoint. It is addressed to the one infinite substance, to God or nature, which is not going to change, which is what it is, necessarily, eternally, without alternative. And Spinoza makes a claim here that is one of the most extraordinary in the history of philosophy. He says, the intellectual love of the mind toward God is the very love with which God loves himself. Read that slowly. The human being's intellectual love of God, the mind's comprehension and affirmation of the necessity and beauty of the whole, is not a one-way relationship between a finite creature and an infinite creator. Because the infinite substance, God or nature, is not a person standing apart from the human mind and receiving its love from the outside. The intellectual love that arises in the human mind is itself an expression of the infinite substance, God loving himself through the finite mode that is this particular human consciousness. The wave is not loving the ocean from the outside. The wave is the ocean momentarily, loving its own existence. This is the summit of Spinoza's philosophy. Not as a mystical claim, it is argued with the same geometric rigor as everything else, as the conclusion toward which the entire structure has been building. The human being who achieves the third kind of knowledge, who sees truly, who grasps necessity directly, who loves the whole in the particular, is not a creature approaching God, is not even a creature receiving God, is God in the specific form of this finite consciousness, knowing himself. The distance between the human and the divine collapses, not because the human has become infinite, but because the infinite has always been expressed in the human. And the knowledge, the genuine, direct, transformative knowledge, is the moment when the expression becomes conscious of being an expression. The wave knows it is water. And in that knowing, not in any comfort that follows from it, not in any reward, but in the knowing itself, is the only liberation Spinoza thought was honestly available. Not from the necessity, through the necessity, into it. There is a version of Spinoza that lives entirely in the metaphysics, in the one substance and the attributes and the modes and the intellectual love of God. A philosophy of pure interior transformation, addressed to the individual consciousness seeking liberation from the bondage of the passive emotions. That version exists. It is real, but it is incomplete, because Spinoza was not only a metaphysician, he was a political philosopher, a man who lived in a specific political and religious context, the Dutch Republic of the 17th century, a place of relative but fragile tolerance, and who understood with the precision that his philosophical method demanded that the liberation of the individual mind is not possible in a political vacuum. That freedom of thought depends on political conditions, that the conditions can be made better or worse by the decisions of those who hold power, and that the argument for those better conditions is not merely pragmatic but deeply connected to the nature of what a human being is. He published in 1670 the Theologico-Political Treatise, anonymously. He was not foolish about the risks. The book had no author's name on the title page, its publisher was listed under a false name and a false city, and it was still immediately banned in multiple jurisdictions and condemned by almost every religious authority that encountered it. Because what it argued was not merely radical, it was, from the perspective of every established religious and political authority of the time, foundational dynamite. The argument about the Bible is where he begins, and he brings to the Bible the same unflinching analytical method he brings to everything. He treats it as a historical text, a human document, produced by human beings in specific historical circumstances, expressing the understanding that those human beings had access to, limited by their time and their culture and their specific cognitive situation. Not the word of God in any literal sense, the word of human beings doing their best to understand God in the only ways available to them, through imagination and prophecy and the specific stories that were meaningful to their communities. The prophets were not philosophers. They did not have access to Spinoza's third kind of knowledge, the rational, necessary, subspecie eternitatis understanding of the whole. They had what he calls the first kind, imagination, vision, the vivid particular image rather than the necessary universal. They communicated through stories and commandments and vivid imagery because their audience needed stories and commandments and vivid imagery. Not because these were the highest form of truth, but because they were the most accessible form of guidance for the communities they were addressing. This is not an attack on religious experience. It is a careful, respectful, and completely devastating reduction of its epistemic authority. The Bible cannot be the source of philosophical truth in Spinoza's analysis, because it was not produced by philosophical knowledge. It was produced by imagination and communal memory and prophetic vision. These have their value, particularly the moral value, the emphasis on justice and compassion and the basic obligations of community. That value is real. Spinoza does not dismiss it. But the Bible cannot override reason, cannot contradict the deliverances of philosophy and science, cannot require the mind to believe what the mind's clearest operations reveal to be false. Now here is where the politics enters. Spinoza argues that the confusion of religious authority with political authority, the claim of the clergy to govern not merely the spiritual life of citizens but their intellectual and civic life as well, is one of the most destructive confusions in human history. Because it weaponizes religion, it takes what has genuine value as a guide to moral community and turns it into an instrument of political control. It suppresses the very freedom of thought and expression that is not merely useful for human flourishing, but is, in Spinoza's analysis, constitutive of it. Human beings are thinking beings, the conatus, the striving that constitutes existence, in a human being includes the striving of the intellect. To suppress the intellect's freedom, to command people to believe what they do not believe, to punish thought rather than only actions, is not merely politically oppressive. It is a violation of what the human being most fundamentally is. This argument, the argument for freedom of thought and expression as a natural right, grounded not in political convention but in the nature of the thinking being, was one of the most important contributions to the political philosophy of liberalism. It passed through the next century's thought like a current, into Locke and Bayle and the early Enlightenment, and eventually into the documents that established modern liberal democracies. But here's the strange part. Spinoza is not a simple libertarian. He does not think that freedom is unlimited, or that society has no right to restrict the expression of ideas. What he argues is more precise and more interesting. Freedom of thought must be protected. Freedom of action, the external expression of thought in a way that disrupts the civic order, can be legitimately regulated. The line is between the inner and the outer, between what you believe and what you do. The state has a legitimate interest in the second. It has no legitimate business in the first. And the reason it has no legitimate business in the first is not merely pragmatic, not merely that thought policing doesn't work, though it doesn't. The reason is philosophical. The thought is the person. The mind striving is the conatus of the human being at its most essential. The suppression of thought is the suppression of existence. He knew what this cost him. He had been excommunicated for something. Whether it was an early version of the ideas in the ethics, or a different transgression, some combination of biblical criticism, unorthodox theological views, political opinions, the community that formed him could not contain what he was becoming, and he chose becoming over-belonging. This is not nothing. Spinoza lived in genuine isolation for most of his adult life. Not miserable isolation. He had friends, correspondents, people who valued him, but cut off from the community that had given him language and tradition and the God he had spent years studying. He did not replace it with another community. He replaced it with the argument itself, with the long, careful, geometrically precise construction of a vision of reality that was, he believed, more honest than any available alternative. He did not seek popularity. He sought clarity, and the clarity he achieved, the specific, cold, beautiful, honest clarity of the ethics, was only possible because he had paid the price of belonging. The thought was worth the cost, or at least he lived as if it was. Whether it was, you will have to decide for yourself. We have come a long way from the extinguished candles of the Amsterdam synagogue, through the one infinite substance and its infinite attributes, through the identity of God and nature, through the mind and body as two descriptions of one reality, through the bondage of imagination and the passive emotions, through the three kinds of knowledge and the intellectual love of God, through the politics of free thought and the dangerous book published without a name. And we arrive at the end of the argument in a place that is both clear and deeply unsettling. Everything is necessary, not as a comforting thought, as a description of the actual structure of reality. The one infinite substance expresses itself through its attributes and modes with the same necessity with which a mathematical truth follows from its axioms. There was never any alternative. There is no alternative now. There will never be an alternative. The specific arrangement of everything, every particle, every thought, every decision, every moment of suffering, every moment of joy, is precisely and completely what it had to be, including you, including this moment, including the reading of these words, which was determined before you were born by a chain of causes that traces back to the beginning of whatever beginning means in a system without a beginning in Spinoza's sense, in an infinite substance that was always already complete. Now sit with that, not as a philosophical proposition, as an actual feature of your experience right now, the decision you're going to make tomorrow, the conversation you're about to have, the emotion you're currently carrying, the life you're in the middle of, all of it was determined, not by God in the sense of a person who decided, by God in Spinoza's sense, the infinite necessity of everything, expressing itself through the modes it had to produce, including the mode that is you. This should be devastating. And for some people, encountering it for the first time it is. The feeling of freedom, the experience of deliberating, of choosing, of being the author of your own actions, is not, on this view, what it presents itself as being. It is the experience of a process that was determined, feeling itself as free because it does not know what determined it. You are not the author, you are the expression. But here's the strange part. Spinoza does not arrive at despair. He arrives at something that, approached honestly, is more stable and more real than the ordinary consolations. Something that has been labelled over the centuries with different words, equanimity, beatitude, liberation, and that he himself describes with the careful precision of a man who does not want to oversell what he has found. He calls it blessedness, and he is immediately clear about what it is not. It is not the reward for virtue. It is not the feeling of having done the right thing and being recognised for it. It is not the relief of suffering ended or the pleasure of desire satisfied. It is none of the things that the imagination projects as happiness. It is the specific emotional state, the joy, in his technical sense, of the mind operating at full power, understanding, clearly, comprehensively, at the level of the third kind of knowledge, grasping the necessity of everything, seeing the particular through the universal, loving the whole in the part, being in the specific activity of that understanding an expression of the infinite substance that knows itself through the finite mode of this consciousness, the wave knowing it is water, and in the knowing, not in some consequence of the knowing, but in the knowing itself, the specific active self-caused joy of the free person, free in Spinoza's sense, not free from causation, free in the sense of being caused by their own nature, by the intellect operating at its full power, rather than by external forces they do not understand. This distinction matters. Think about it carefully. When you are driven by fear of something you do not understand, you are passive. The fear is happening to you. You are being moved by a cause you have not grasped. When you are driven by the desire for something your imagination presents as good, and that desire turns out to be based on a partial picture, you are passive. You are moved by a fragment. But when you understand, when you see clearly, when the necessity of something is grasped directly rather than imagined partially, you are active. The knowing is yours. It arises from your nature, from the intellect functioning as it most fully is. The emotion that accompanies it, the joy, the intellectual love, is not imposed from outside, it is accessed from within. This is the only freedom available, and it is real. Now think about what this does to grief. You have loved something, someone, and they are gone. The loss is real, the grief is real, and the imagination says this should not have happened. Things should have been otherwise. The wish for an alternative past, the ache of the if only, is part of the ordinary grief, part of what makes grief so heavy. Spinoza does not tell you not to grieve. He's too honest for that kind of instruction. What he says is something different. He says, the grief that includes the wish for an alternative past, that specific dimension of suffering, is not caused by the loss. It is caused by the failure to see the necessity, the belief that things could have been otherwise, which is itself a product of the first kind of knowledge, the partial picture, the fragment. The person who sees clearly, who grasps at the level of genuine understanding rather than cold abstract resignation, that the loss was as necessary as everything else, that it could not have been otherwise, that the loved thing was exactly what it was for exactly as long as it had to be, that person does not stop grieving. But the specific dimension of the grief that is about the wish for the impossible, the grinding, self-consuming wish that the past were different, that dimension quiets. Not because the loss matters less, because the necessity of the loss is seen, and seeing necessity, really seeing it, not just accepting it intellectually but grasping it at the level of the third kind of knowledge, changes the emotional register. Not from sadness to happiness, from the suffering of the person fighting the necessary to the grief, which is different and more bearable, of the person who has understood it. The intellectual love of God is not a feeling that replaces grief. It is the context within which grief and joy and everything else is held. The context of the whole, the subspecie eternitatis, the wave, in its waving, knowing it is water, and finding in that knowing, not peace exactly, but something more solid than peace. The specific stability of a consciousness that has ceased to fight the necessity and begun instead to understand it. Spinoza died at 44, glass dust in his lungs, small rooms, complete philosophical isolation, in the sense that no one of his contemporaries fully engaged with what he had built. Not in poverty, he lived modestly but adequately, not in bitterness. The letters he exchanged with his circle suggest a man of genuine warmth and remarkable equanimity. Not in regret, there is no evidence that he wished he had been other than what he was. He died having written the most complete, the most honest, and one of the most demanding philosophical visions in the history of human thought. A vision that refused every comfort that honesty could not sustain, that traced the argument wherever it led, regardless of what it cost, that ended not in despair but in the specific hard-won, intellectually rigorous affirmation of existence precisely as it is. He was not happy, that is probably too simple. He was free, in his own sense, and the freedom was not despite the necessity. It was through it, into it, as it. The wave was the ocean all along, it just had to see it. And in the seeing, that clear, cold, complete, extraordinary seeing, was everything Spinoza thought a human being could honestly have. Not everything we wish for, everything that is real.